Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we should get started for today's brown bag lunch, which is almost an entry to what I think will be the next few weeks of intensive study on the history of graphic designs. But today's talk is going to be about someone who's not so well known in the US, but is a figure in British design, I would say, equivalent to someone like Charles Eames or Paul Rand, someone who in many respects defined the visual culture in Britain in the middle years of the 20th century, and who was perhaps best known because he did so much of the visual imagery associated with great events like the Festival of Britain. Speaking personally, I find his wartime work amongst the most interesting, which I might come back to slightly later. But he had a very long career and indeed worked across the full spectrum of graphic design and exhibition design in Britain. Well, we're very fortunate in all this to have not just a historian or critic talking about Abram Games, but his daughter. On my left, Naomi Games, who has written on her father extensively and indeed has curated an exhibition on his work, which we'll be touring. So I'm just going to hand over now to Naomi, and we'll hear her take on her father's work and his role in British design.
Thank you, and thank you guys for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah. There's 60 years of work here, and I tend to drone on a lot, but I'm going to make it pretty quick, okay? And we might have time to come back to things. I'm here because there's an exhibition in Rochester, which is bloody cold. And it's travelling. It's going to Pasadena after there. And it's called Abram Games 20th Century Social... I'd forgotten, actually, social design. But it's a sort of Abram Games for Dummies exhibition. It's very, very simple. And an introduction to Abram Games. This is, in 2014, Abram was 100. He was dead, but he was 100. And he was celebrated on a series of stamps. There were 10 remarkable Britons, and Abram was the only graphic designer to ever appear on a stamp, which I'm so proud of. So this is my dad as a stamp, and I can lick his head. It's up and down. I won't go into the history, but I'll do it very quickly. He was born in the East End of London, and his family were emigres from Eastern Europe, and they were Jewish, and my grandfather was a photographer. And Abram, as a child, helped his father in the photographic studio, and it was there that he learnt to use the airbrush. And I have one of his airbrushes here, which you are welcome to pass round. He was a master at the airbrush. I don't know if any of you guys use an airbrush. Paul, do you know?
I have in the past, but not now.
It's not an easy thing to master. It's a really difficult tool to use, and it's tedious. But Abram was so good at using the airbrush that he often signed his cheques with it. So that's a little drawing he did with the airbrush. He helped his father in the photographic studio, and he was also thinking that he would become the best designer in Britain. That was his ambition. Posters in the 1930s were just illustration with a bit of text at the bottom, and you could change the illustration and the text, didn't matter. But Abram wanted to design a poster that had the text integrated into the image, and he devised a motto for himself, which he would live by for the rest of his life. He called this maximum meaning, minimum means. So everything he did had to be as simple as possible. And also with as little text as possible, because he hated hand lettering, because in those days, of course, everything had to be hand lettered, and he thought this was a pain, so he didn't do it. Now, this airmail picture, he's using the airbrush, and very minimal text. And it's a piece of artwork. And after he died in 1996, I found this piece of artwork, and I thought, gosh, this is beautiful. And I sent it to the post office in London, and I said, can you use this? And they said, oh no, it's far too modern. He designed it in 1935. So you can see he's integrating text and image, and he's using the airbrush, and he's keeping everything as simple as possible. Pieces of artwork that he was doing for his portfolio, they were never published. He was very influenced by this guy, and there's going to be a big exhibition of Kaufer at the Cooper Hewitt. He collected Kaufers. All these guys were using the airbrush, but Abram wanted to do better than that. And of course, he was very influenced by the great Cassandra and 3 other Frenchmen, all beginning with C. Paul Kona, Jean Carlou, Cassandra, and an English guy called Austin Cooper. He realized that drawing would be the key to being a successful designer. And he went to St. Martin's School of Art, where Bruce went, actually. This is my friend Bruce, and he went there. But after 2 terms, he thought, this is rubbish, and all the art teachers aren't any good, and he wasn't talented enough, and he left after 2 terms. So he thought he'd teach himself, and he went in his lunch times to the Royal College of Surgeons, where he drew bits of cadavers, and he taught himself anatomy. And I am rushing this, I'm very sorry, but I'm determined to get everything in. So he was helping his father in the photographic studio, and it was the 1930s, and he thought he'd better also get a job because they were very poor. And he eventually got a job at a commercial art studio. There was no such term as graphic design in the 1930s. So he got a job for a man called Victor Askew. And these 2 guys, my father and Victor Askew, hated each other. And Askew kept wanting to sack my father, and it took him 4 years. But Abram continued to do life drawing classes 4 nights a week while he was at Victor Askew's. And he designed these 2 posters using very little colour, because printing in colour then was very expensive. And he won 2nd prize for Where There's Dirt, There's Danger. And his parents said, well, 2nd prize is just not good enough. You've got to win 1st prize. So he said, okay. So he won 1st prize for this LCC evening class poster. And the public thought it looked too much like a Russian constructivist poster. But then he was very influenced by the Russian constructivists. One day, while he was at Victor Askew's, he was a terrible show-off, my father. So one day he lined up 4 studio chairs and said to all his colleagues, watch me. And he started to jump over these 4 chairs. And as he was in midair, Mr. Askew came into the studio and said, you're fired. You're a bad influence on everybody. So he went home to his mother and said, Victor Askew's finally fired me. And his mother went, oi, 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 go and apologise. And he said, I will never apologise. From now on, I will never work for anybody again. And I will be my own master and my own slave. And he never did work for anybody again. And he was one of the few designers in Britain who never worked for anybody. He worked entirely on his own. So everything he did was his own work. So he got the sack. He had to find a job. And he took his portfolio around to the commercial art studios, and they all thought that his work was far too advanced, far too modern. They didn't understand it. Until he got a double-page spread in a very influential magazine called Art and Industry. You've heard of that book? really important magazine. So Abram bought 70 copies of this double-page spread saying, here's the work of a young designer. And he hand wrote in very, very bad handwriting a letter saying, please here's some examples of my work, please could you consider me for a poster design. And eventually, Frank Pick, who was a very, very visionary patron of the arts, he was the man in charge of our London transport, and he revolutionised and rebranded London transport. He employed Knight Kauffer, he employed a lot of good designers, and he phoned up Abram and he said, your work's very interesting, come and see me, and commissioned his first poster, which was a train every 90 seconds, using the airbrush, using 2 colours. And again, after he died, I found these 2 pieces of work here, the concerts and the galleries. And I thought, wow, these are beautiful. I took them to London Transport. Can you use them? Guess what they said? Far too modern. Crazy. And then the phone started to ring. And he's using a lot of hands here. Like a lot of designers in those days, you have a lot of hands. And the Stack Safely was for the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. And this sums up his maximum meaning, minimum means. Everything is said very simply. You need very little text. Spanish Civil War happened, and Abram was a lifelong socialist. And he did these 2 posters without any payment. They're not great posters, but they're very important posters. By the time he was called up for the army, he had had 24 posters published, and this is a painting of Abram in his brand new uniform. And the man at the desk who was giving him his position in the army said, we see that you're a poster designer. You'd be very good at drawing maps. And Abram said, I hate drawing maps. He was very determined and he knew his own mind. And then the guy said, well, how about a cook? And Abram said, can't cook. How about the medical corps? Can't stand the sight of blood. How about a driver? Can't drive, never could drive. And this guy was getting very exasperated and said, look, I'm trying to save you from going off to the front line. And Abram said, please send me off to the infantry. I'm a Londoner and I'm Jewish, and it's very, very important to me that I go and fight like everybody else. So they sent him off to the infantry, and while he was in the infantry, he was in the barracks and he started to do these lovely drawings of soldiers darning their socks and writing home. And he realised that the barracks were very dull places. There was brown, creosoted walls, and on the walls there were just little black and white diagrams saying, don't speak, look after your weapons. And Abram had an idea, and he said, it would be great to have beautiful posters on the wall, and they would speak to the soldiers and they would notice them. And it would be fun for the soldiers to have a bit of colour around and something that they could actually look at rather than charts and diagrams. So he wrote a memorandum and submitted it to his superiors, and he entitled it Army Poster Propaganda. And they looked at it and they said, very interesting, and they put it away. He heard nothing more until a year later. He was summoned to the War Office in London, and they said, we see that you're a poster designer. We need a poster designing for the Royal Armoured Corps. And Abram said, okay, I can do it. And this is the first of 100 posters he did for the army. In London in April, we're going to have a huge exhibition of Abram's war work because he was the only ever official war poster artist. There's been lots of war artists, but never war poster artists. So if you're in London, contact me and I'll take you to the exhibition. This poster is one of the most famous, notorious posters of the war. he was working in the War Office in his studio in the attic. He always liked working in attics. And there was a knock on the door, and this woman came in, this girl came in, and she said, look, I hear that you're a designer, and we need a poster for the ATS dance. And this was a women's department in the war office. And nobody wanted to join the ATS. The Queen did. Our Queen was a member of this. But because the uniform was very dowdy, it was very unsexy. And Abram wanted to make a poster that would attract women. So this girl walked in and he was furious. He said, there's a war going on. I'm not here to design frivolous posters. So go away. And as she was leaving, he looked back as she was walking out the door and realized that, in his own words, she was rather a corker. And he said, look, come in, I'm very sorry, come in. I'll do a deal with you. You pose for me in this uniform that I have to do a poster for, and I'll do your poster for your dance. Is that okay? And so she said yes. And this poster was produced. She attracted more. She was the most successful war poster that has ever been produced. The girls were lining up round the block trying to join the ATS. They loved this poster, and the cartoonists had a field day, and it was a great success until she was taken to Parliament while there was a war going on. For 5 weeks, this poster was discussed in Parliament, and they banned her. And the reason they banned her and pulped her was because she was far too sexy. And they didn't like it. And our girl should be attracted into the army through patriotism and not glamour. And she's got far too much lipstick on. So Abram was fed up, and he went back to his superiors and he said, look, I wrote a memorandum saying that what's needed in the army are health posters, security posters, and can you find this memorandum? So they dug up this memo, and they looked at it and they said, look, it's interesting, but we'll give you 6 months to design the kind of posters that you think are necessary for the army. And if this experiment doesn't work after 6 months, you go back to your unit. He said, great. He was given an unprecedented free hand. He would think of the idea. He would do the slogans. He would do all the artwork. He would go to the printers. And because he was using his airbrush, there was a rationing of printing inks because there was a war going on. But with using his airbrush, he managed to make the ink go further and to get incredible colours. These posters are small because the paper, there was a lot of paper rationing in those days during the war. And sometimes posters were printed on the backs of other posters. So he started his army poster propaganda posters. And the men in the barracks didn't know how to wash. They hadn't left home. They were young men. Oh, sorry. What am I doing? Oh, I think. Yeah. He was the son of a photographer, and he was asked by MI5, which is the security service, to design a poster for this very, very secret subject called radar. And no one knew what radar was. And he said, what's radar? And they said, we can't tell you, but all we can tell you is that you twiddle a few knobs. So he designed this poster, and he thought, looks very flat. So what do you think he did? Anyone got an idea what those stripes are?
Shutters.
Venetian blinds. Venetian blinds. Yeah. So he photogrammed his Venetian blind in his studio, and he got that. Very inventive, my father. So, and he wanted to design a poster showing the inside of a barrel of a gun, and he couldn't work out how to do it until someone suggested that he took a pin. He covered the barrel of his gun, a Lee Enfield rifle, and with cardboard, put a cover on the barrel, made a little pinprick, and exposed the light, and this is actually the inside of his barrel of his gun. Before James Bond, he was the first to do that spiral. Again, he then used his airbrush to continue the spiral, and you can see he's using very few colours, a lot of red. These are beautiful posters. He always did 1 and 1 equals 3. He always managed to make juxtapositions with things and make them whole. These are I'm very fond of these two posters. And a lot of allotment growers in London always want these posters. I can go on and on about these posters, but I've no time short. So he called these the Symphony Macabre. And he's using a hand here, you can see. He hated using photographs, but with these posters, precise identification was really important. So he would use a photograph. He was very influenced by the John Hartfield, the collage artist, and also by surrealists. There was a big exhibition in London on the surrealists in 1936, and everybody was influenced by the surrealists. So this child found a blind was hanging up on the barrack walls, and Abram went in to the barracks and said to the soldiers, "Why are you tearing down this poster?" He kept seeing it on the floor, and they said, "We cannot live with it. It reminds us of our sisters, our children. We hate it." And Abram realized at that point that whether you liked his work or you didn't, it was noticed, and that was the important thing. And he thought, yeah, they've noticed it. They didn't notice the black and white diagrams, but they noticed his posters. And of course, they were discussed. There was an organisation called the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, and it was to educate the soldiers about why they were fighting in this war. And Churchill, our great leader, of course, hated this socialist organisation and eventually closed it down. And Your Britain Fight for It Now at the bottom was in an exhibition showing the public what the War Office were doing. And it was on the wall, and Churchill's minion grabbed it off the wall and rolled it up and took it straight to Churchill. And Abram was baffled and said, why did they take this poster off the wall? Churchill said, this is distorted propaganda, disgraceful libel. And the reason why they took this poster down was because you see the little boy at the bottom. He's got rickets, which is a vitamin D deficiency. And Churchill said, there's no such thing as rickets in Britain. It doesn't exist. And Abram had done his research. He was very, very hot on research. And rickets was known as the English disease. And so this poster was another poster that was banned by Churchill. They didn't get on at all, Churchill and Abram. By this time, he had been made official war poster artist uniquely. Very proud of that. I'm very proud of my dad, by the way. But he always liked to draw from life, and he was asked to draw a poster for the parachute unit. So he said, I've got to go and draw them in real life. And he spent a week with the unit, and he drew them and he photographed them. And a week after this poster was published, the whole of that unit had got killed in Arnhem. It was a terrible battle, and the parachutists had a terrible time. And he was terribly upset, and he said, look, I've got a cushy job in the War Office. Please send me back to fight. And they said, no, we can always replace a soldier, but we can never replace you. And what you're doing is just as important as being a soldier. Again, more hands, lots and lots of hands. We're coming out of the war now. This is my mother's poster. So it's he was always going in his lunch times to see exhibitions, and one day he was coming out of an exhibition near the War Office, and as he was coming out, this very attractive woman was going in. So what did my father do? He decided to follow her in. They were the only two people in the exhibition. which was by a painter called Graham Sutherland. So he followed this woman round the exhibition, and she kept trying to shrug him off. She noticed he was in uniform, and she couldn't stand this man at her shoulder. And he went up to her and he said, "Do you like the work?" And she turned around and she thought, "Oh, it's Graham Sutherland," because he looked rather like Graham Sutherland. And she said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Would you like to see some more?" And she said, "Yes, I would." So he said, "Come up to my studio." So he realised that she had an accent because she was German. So he couldn't she was an enemy alien. She was a German Jewish refugee. So he had to sign her into the War Office as Miss Games. And as Miss Smith. And this poster was on the easel. He was working on it. And 6 months later, they were married. And this is my mother's poster because he hid her name in there. And it's hidden. And the curators of the exhibition that's coming up at the War Museum said, "We want to show where it is and it would be great." I said, "No, you can't show it. It's a secret." And it's half the game is trying to find my mother's name in there. I won't have it put online because I think it's great when kids come in and they look and they look and they look. It's a great thing. In 1945, he had a very close friend working in the film unit at the War Office called Paul Rother. He became a very important documentary filmmaker. And Paul Rother knocked on Abram's door one day and said, "Abram, I've just come back from Belsen, from Germany, and you have got to see what I've shot." And it was the footage of Bergen, of the victims of the Holocaust. And Abram never got over that. And he started to work for an organisation called the Jewish Relief Unit. He trained people to go to help victims of the Holocaust. And he did these 3 posters that are not wonderful to put on your walls, but he did these 3 posters gratis. He never charged for these. So we've done the war. You'll have to come to the exhibition. I'm going to send you an invitation for the war. Posters after the war were covering the bomb sites, and they were very important. And Abram wanted, like his war posters, he wanted his posters to be a power for good. And he didn't want to join the commercial world. He wanted to have posters that educated rather than selling products. But London Transport called, and he did these rather unusual posters for London Transport. He called them the bowing tickets. He's still using his airbrush. And these were the kind of posters that Abram wanted to do, posters that meant something, that were there for a reason. I am going to hurry this. 1948, the government decided that they would have a party for the whole of Britain, and they would call this a tonic for the nation. And they invited 12 designers to enter a competition to design the Festival of Britain symbol. And Abram won the competition. It's the public's copyright. He won £50. I don't know if you know. And it's copyright free, so we don't make any money on it, which is a shame. But he designed the symbol first without the flags around it. He called it the bunting. And they said, it's a great symbol, but it reminds us too much of a war poster. Not surprisingly, because he was used to designing war posters. And they said, you've got to make it more festive. And he didn't know what to do until he saw my mummy hanging out the washing. So there's a picture of my mother. I'm in her tummy. And he thought, great idea, I'll hang out the washing. So that's the washing hanging around there. So he was very involved in the Festival of Britain. He designed a mural, he designed the symbol, and he designed this catalogue cover. Anyone who was involved in the Festival of Britain was made. It was an important festival and very influential for designers. It was really important. And I have a tin of biscuits, and It's nearly 70 years old, and this is what. And if you open the lid, God, it stinks. But there's a tin of biscuits with the symbol. And one day, the symbol appeared everywhere. It was embedded into flowers, flower beds. It was on knickers. There are lots of people that collect Festival of Britain items. They're cranks. They're amazing. Anyway, one day he got called up by his friends from school who became doctors and surgeons. And they said, Abram, we've got something to show you, but you must never tell anyone where we're taking you. So they took him to a hospital and took him down to the morgue where they had laid out his symbol. This is his symbol, right? And guess what it's made from?
Eyeballs?
Sorry?
Eyeballs?
Gallstones?
Yeah. Oh, you got it. You knew that.
That was
You're the first person who's ever...
God, maybe I'm suffering.
So this poor woman had died from 604 gallstones, and secret. So they took out her gallstones and presented Abram with that. We don't actually have that.
No.
We have a photograph of it. So 70 years on, I can tell you this.
Yeah, what did he say? Did he say
He
thank
was
you?
thrilled to bits. He loved it. He entered a competition for the Olympic Games stamp, and he won it. In 1948, we had the Olympic Games in London. No designer must ever sign a stamp, but he managed to get his name on the stamp. So from now on, he was called Olympic Games, not Abram Games. And then he had to enter a competition to design the stamp for the Festival of Britain, and thank God he won it. He would have been very fed up if people had used his symbol otherwise, but he won it, and so he designed the stamp. And he liked designing stamps because he always worked small, so they were like miniature posters to him. And you can see that after the war, Abram kept every single working drawing that he did, and if you ever come to London and you want to look at his archive, you're very welcome to contact me, because I keep everything under my bed, and I can show you all the working processes of his work, which is the most interesting piece of an archive. I don't know if you've got any in the Chisholm.
No, we haven't. No, because it was only Chichol's collection.
Oh, I see.
Up till the 30s,
Yeah.
really.
They didn't tend to keep anything before then. There was a guy called Lee Elliott who designed this little speedbird emblem, this little rocket paper dart. And when you designed a poster for BOAC, British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, you had to use that emblem in it. And Abram managed to use it very effectively. He's still using his airbrush, but he's also laying flat colour. And this one, 1951, was he used the elements of his Festival of Britain symbol. So it's for the Festival of Britain. And he's used it here in negative space for the 1950. And they're very beautiful posters. The poster See Britain by Train, his ambition was to design a poster without any text on it. And I think he probably submitted this See Britain by Train poster without any text. But I think British Rail thought, oh God, no, you've got to have some text. So I think he plonked the text at the top on, but it says all it needs to say, it doesn't need any text. And we have a place called Blackpool in London, which is not as sunny as that, I can tell you. It's a miserable place. So he was asked to design a poster for the Financial Times. After winning the Festival of Britain symbol competition, he was now in demand. He achieved his ambition of being the great poster designer, and people were asking him to work. And he designed this poster for the Financial Times, and you can see his thought process here. So he's got a man reading the Financial Times, and then he thought, I'll get rid of the man altogether, and I'll do a manuspaper. So we've got this little manuspaper He did a series of 8 posters for the Financial Times, and it was a great campaign. Very, not for women. I mean, it was very, but men then had umbrellas and bowler hats, and they were in the city. And I will talk about this later, because we got a little film of this. It was the first, he won a competition for the first moving BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, ident. And this is the contraption he made with the help of his students at the Royal College of Art. All tutors then had to have ties and suits. You've got a tie? You're amazing, yeah. And they all smoked. And this is my dad at the Royal College of Art. And he didn't like art school, but he had to earn a living. So he taught 1 day a week at the Royal College of Art, which is a graduate centre. And he taught there for 7 years, and the students were very scared of him because he came in on a Monday morning, opened all the windows, because you can't concentrate when it's hot, so you have to have a cold studio, opened all the windows and said, here's your brief, and I want to see your work next week on the walls, and if you don't do it, you're out. Because he said that the world, that being a designer was tough, the outside world was tough, and if they didn't manage to reach their deadlines, they were out. They had to reach their deadlines. So every week there was a dance at the Royal College, and my mother went to the dance, and one of the students came up to her and said, Mrs. Games, we're so pleased your husband comes once a week. And she said, oh, thank you very much. No, if he came more often, we would all leave. But his students became very important designers. I don't know if you've heard of someone called David Gentleman. That was his prize guy. Len Dayton was another guy. He didn't become a designer in the end. But he was a tough tutor, but they really respected him. And I'll show you a film of this working afterwards. It's called A Kona Coffee Maker. He taught himself model making and designed this. This is the 1962 version of the Kona Coffee Maker, but I've got another one. Penguin Books. So you're going to have an exhibition of Tishold. And then Tishold was working at Penguin Books, which is a paperback publishing house. And then a guy called Hunt Schmoller worked after Tishold, or with Tishold. And then Hunt Schmoller asked Abram to be the art director of a new colour campaign, because the director of Penguin Books realised that there were just typographical covers on the Penguin Books, and he thought that American publishers were coming in with their pan paperbacks, and they were all colour covers, and he thought, we'll have an experiment for a year, and we will have, instead of having typographical covers, we'll have colour covers. So Abram and his students, he got every single student at the Royal College of Art to design the covers with him. So these are Abram's covers. And they produced 36 colour covers in a year. They all got paid the same, including Abram. But Abram designed the grid. And then after a year, Sir Alan Lane, the director of Penguin Books, thought, these are awful, didn't like them at all. And he called them breast sellers, and you can see why. And it was Abram's fault, and that was a campaign that didn't happen. I mean, it happened for a year, but that was it. But it was a shame, because they were great. The methods of, I don't know if you know about printing methods. So posters before the war were printed by chromolithography, very complicated process. Then during the war, as the chromolithographers enlisted into the army, there was photolithography. But now posters were being printed by silkscreen printing. And Abram never drove, and he always travelled on tops of buses, and he saw his delicate airbrush posters hanging up next to the posters from America. So you got all the photographic posters coming in from America. The studios, the commercial art studios from America were taking root in London. And he thought, I've got to change my style. So he decided that he would change his style. And he said to the bill posters, you can have as much Guinness as you like, and it really doesn't matter which way you hang it. So we would come home from school, and we would see this poster, and he'd say, come in, the kids, come into the studio. And he'd say, what does this say? And we'd say, oh, it looks like a 5. And then he'd say, what else does it say? He'd turn the easel round, and we'd say, Daddy, I want to go out and play. And he'd say, no, you've got to tell me. And he'd say, what is it? What can you see? Well, maybe it's a glass of beer. And if the children didn't understand his work, he would start again. He'd tear it up and start again. But when we got the design, he would put his signature, A Games full stop, on it. And we 3 children were with him while he was dying, and we drank a lot of whiskey. And I said to him jokingly, Daddy, do you want a full stop on your gravestone? That full stop was really important. It was all his own work, and it was the end of his working process. It meant a lot to him. And I said, would you like a full stop? And he said, yes. So my father has a gravestone with Abram Games full stop on the end of it. Very important to him. His Financial Times posters changed style as well, and he liked this flat colour. It afforded him more simplicity. He was very pleased with that. The poster in the middle was done in 1951, and that's a long story which I don't think we have time for. No. But you can see he's a different style, and these posters were very successful, and they asked him to design a set of stamps. So that's a set of stamps based on his posters at the top. And again, his little Speedbird BOAC changed style. So these posters were around Britain, and they just hung on the hoardings. And when people see his work, they say, yeah, we know that work, but we didn't know who designed it. Very, very, very simple. They're becoming simpler and simpler. Again, he changed his style here, and I'm going to carry on. This is an incredible poster. Does anyone have a clue who the client is? The one on the left. I don't know how he got away with this. This is a poster without any text on it. But there is text because the names of all his children are hidden in it. And I won't tell you where.
It's London Transport.
Yeah. Well done. And I don't know how they accepted it. And you see the little rondelle?
Yeah.
How did that happen? You wouldn't be allowed to do that now, but that's extraordinary that he got away with that. And we have a line on the Underground called the Victoria line, and a lot of designers were asked to design tiles for that. And there was a pub in Stockwell, there still is, called the Swan. And people said, well, I can't see that. And Abram said, well, you've got to step back, but I wouldn't advise it, because you'd fall into the track. He was quite mischievous. So it's a swan, but you've got to see it at a distance. He was Jewish, and he designed a fifth of his output was for the Jewish community. He didn't charge for that mostly. So he taught himself how to make a stained glass window, and that's real barbed wire. It's for the Holocaust. It's a Holocaust memorial window. And he's got a Star of David, a torn prayer shawl, barbed wire, and another hand coming out. And one day I came home from school, and he was on the floor with a big sheet of paper, dipping in a Chinese calligraphy pen into black ink. And we said, what are you doing, Daddy? And he said, I don't know. He was just going like this, writing. And he said, I have no idea what's going on. And this hand took over automatically. And he stepped back and he started to cry. and he said, gosh, this is the names of all the concentration camps. And he called this tear writing. And it was a very moving, it was a mural, a very moving mural for the Holocaust Memorial. The last poster, he did a lot of posters for London Transport, and this is the last poster he did for London Transport, and you can see his thought process here. He's thinking of a giraffe, a zebra, but he goes with the tiger. And this is a poster he did for Shakespeare using all of Shakespeare's plays. There's stories to all these posters, but I'm aware of the time. So he was often asked, what are your favourite posters? And he said, they're all my favourite, they're like my children, but if you ask me which 3 posters I want to be remembered by, it's not this one, it's this one. This is a self-portrait Abram did of himself, and this is the most important poster in the war. But I found this poster, a Dutch guy had designed this poster, and I thought, plagiarism is not on, right? But I really love this, and I think Abram would have loved this.
I didn't get it until you pointed out.
That's the beauty of it, it's very, very subtle. It's brilliant, isn't it? I think Abram would be tickled pink by that. And this one, which he went to Rome to get his brief from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. And the guy said to him, when you design this poster, you have to be a philosopher as well as an artist. And it kept ringing in his head, and he did 200 roughs, which we have, of this thing, and he went back to his original design. And it's not a poster you want to keep, really. It was quite contentious, but a really important poster to him. And then he was asked to do, you know what Guinness is, everybody? It's great stuff. He was, in the 1950s, posters for Guinness were little illustrations with pelicans and toucans, and they were designed by a guy called John Gilroy. Beautiful little posters, beautiful posters. But Guinness decided they wanted a new campaign, and he submitted this sketch. He was always very businesslike, and he took this little sketch to Guinness, and they said, ooh, where are all the other designs? And he said, I only ever do one design. Because he always thought if you gave a client more than one design, they would then say, well, we want a bit of this one, and why not do this one? And blah, blah. So he said, no, I'm the expert, you're the client, and I know what you need, and I will only ever do one design for you. So he said, if you don't like it, get another designer. But this is what you need. And they took 6 months before they plucked up the courage to print it. Too simple. And guess what? It won 5 international awards because Abram knew what he was doing. But he designed this poster on the back of a bus ticket because he always travelled in the tube and on buses, and he always worked because there were no children, no visitors, no telephone, so he could work. And this time he didn't have any paper with him on the bus, but he had his bus ticket. So we still have that bus ticket. And I think I can show you the film. Thank you very much. I have rushed this. How am I doing?
You're fine.
Good. So I'm going to show you the 2 films.
Do you need this?
You just press exit.
Press.
Exit. Escape.
Yeah.
So they're 2 films. So he designed 300 posters and stamps, but this is only a little bit. In how many minutes?
5.
I've written 6 books on him, so you can get there. Is that right? No. They're 2 little. Those 2, yeah. No.
I got
That one and then the Kona. Thank you very much.
Here we are.
Okay, so this is the first moving BBC ident made from piano wire and brass, and it was built in this contraption that you saw a photograph of, and it lasted for 15 seconds actually, just long enough to film it. But it was put in 1953, it was on television, and we didn't have a television. My father thought television was a waste of time. So we went to our grandparents. Can we press it? No, press it again. Press it. So the British public had never seen anything moving apart from people on screen before. And television was just coming into the home in 1953. Do you remember that?
Not exactly, but I've heard about it.
And it was called the Roving Eye, or the Cockeyed Wonder. So the next day, there were letters in the papers saying, "This is monstrous, and the BBC are trying to hypnotise us, and it scares us, and it's awful because it had flashing lights and there was harp music." Okay, thank you. My father always loved controversy. So this is the Kona coffee maker that he designed, and you can buy these on eBay for a lot of money. He designed everything about it, and it makes a great cup of coffee. Bruce, do you remember it?
I think they're popular again right now.
How do you get the coffee out of it?
Well, it's based on a Kipps apparatus that makes oxygen, so it's the pressure sucks up.
No, but how do you where do you pour it? Is that the handle there?
No,
The coffee's on the top.
Oh, I
The
see.
water bubbles up and then comes back down again.
you take the light away. So the methylated spirits at the bottom is in the bottom.
So it boils up and then
Uh-huh.
you turn off the heat, it cools and comes back down.
I see.
And it's wonderful at a dinner party because everybody stares at it and then they listen for the blah, 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 bottom. And then you take the glass and there's a hole at the top.
Uh-huh.
So you put it and it drains. You see that hole at the bottom
Uh-huh.
and it drains. And it's a beautiful piece of sculpture, really. And guess what it's made from? It was just after the war.
Bakelite.
No, that was the other one. He made two versions, one in the 50s and one in 1962, which I showed you a picture of. So it's made from recycled Spitfires. You had to use every scrap of metal. So that makes a very good coffee. And when we were making this film, my friend, the director, decided, he was such a perfectionist, he said, no, we've got to get it right. I made 20 cups of coffee, not cups, but 20 lots of coffee for that. And of course I had to drink it because I can't waste anything. And I was after the... So my father was a great lecturer. After he kind of wound... In the 1980s, he wound down his design practice and became a crazy inventor. I won't go into that. But he often lectured, and he was very good at talking to students and very, very supportive of students. And he always ended his lectures with the 3 C's. And these are qualities that are essential for designers. And I always forget one. Let's see if I can remember. So the 3 C's are curiosity, concentration. See, I've lost it.
Coffee.
Yeah, curiosity, concentration, and it's always one, and it's never the same one. But I will remember it.
Craftsmanship.
No,
Confidence.
no. Courage. Curiosity, concentration, and courage. It's without fail. I always forget one. And then he would say, "Don't forget cash and checks." And then he would also say, don't forget the copyright, because maintaining copyright of your work is very important. And 3 C's are very important.
6 C's.
6 C's. As many C's. And then, obviously, computers. So, okay. How many minutes was that?
Yes, you reached the end. Well, can I ask you all to thank Naomi for this introduction to our know that some of you will be going to classes in a minute, so there won't be time for questions, but you can chat to Naomi over a coffee if you've got time. But hopefully you might get up to Rochester to see the exhibition, and if not,
It's on till March, so it might stop snowing by then.
and who knows, maybe this will have placed Abram Games firmly in your mind for future reference.
And you're very welcome when you're in London. We've got a website called abramgames.com, and I can be contacted on there if you come to London.
Where is the exhibition in London?
It's called the National Army Museum, and it's in Chelsea.
Okay.
And it's only about his war work. Can't say R, so his war.
Is it at that huge armory place?
It's
Is it
not
that-
the
that whatever it's-
Imperial War Museum.
Yeah, no, I know, but there's this, well.
It's in Kensington, in Chelsea, do you know it? They've just rebuilt it, but it will be just about. He designed 100 posters, so it's got all this, and more drawings. So you let me know, and I'll take you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Yeah, I'll invite you to
Super
do it.
interesting.
Yes. Well, please come.